Autobiography of the Antichrist by Jacob A. Eder. Origins. Foreshadowing. From the moment of his conception, his life seemed bound to an unrelenting darkness, as though the fates themselves had cast him from grace even before his first breath. His arrival was no tender welcome to the world, but a grim battle, fraught with pain and peril, his mother's cries echoing through sterile halls, the air heavy with foreboding. Even the doctors and midwives present that day were left with a lingering unease, as though they had witnessed not a birth, but an omen, a life that would wrestle with shadows that stretched beyond what any soul could bear. His childhood, frail and delicate, knew no warmth nor comfort. It was as if every attempt to nurture him was met with some cruel twist of fate, denying him even the simple joys other children took for granted. Illnesses plagued him, each one draining him further, rendering him a ghost of the boy he might have been, and beyond the confines of his own frail body, the world seemed to close in, unforgiving and indifferent. He bore the brunt of his peers' cruelty, a scapegoat for their fears and insecurities, as though the world itself had collectively decided to mark him as other, to make of him an embodiment of everything they feared, yet refused to acknowledge in themselves. They mocked him mercilessly, tore at his spirit with their jeers, their laughter like knives that sliced through flesh but went deeper, cutting into the soul. Teachers, who should have seen his suffering, turned their backs, their eyes averted, as though afraid that mere acknowledgement of his plight might taint them. Family members, too, watched with cold indifference, some with shame for reasons they themselves could not articulate. His very presence seemed to unearth their hidden guilt, their buried secrets, and they despised him for it. Whereupon his isolation became a prison, walls built not of stone, but of silence, rejection, and a growing, gnawing sense that he was not of this world. There was a bleakness in his eyes, a depth that frightened those who dared to look long enough, for it was a reflection of something raw and unfiltered, a void where hope had no place, where dreams were strangled before they could form. His own mind became his only companion. And there, in the uncharted depths of his thoughts, he found a strange solace, a place where the outside world could not reach him, could not bruise him further. Years passed, each one heavier than the last, as he grew from a fragile child into a young man haunted by the ghosts of his past and the unbearable weight of his own existence. Friendships came and went, each one ending in betrayal, each departure another wound that left him more hollow, more withdrawn. Love, fleeting and bitter, touched his life, only to remind him of what he could never truly possess, a bond, a connection, something to tether him to the light. Instead, he found himself drifting further, consumed by a darkness that felt both like a curse and a strange, bitter comfort. In time, his pain twisted into something more, a rage that simmered beneath the surface, a quiet, seething fury at the world that had rejected him, at the people who had cast him aside. Still, even this anger was tempered by sorrow, a hopelessness so deep that it bordered on apathy, for he knew that his fury would change nothing, that his suffering was not unique, but rather a cruel echo of the human condition. Thusly, he carried on, a man hollowed by despair, animated by the faintest spark of defiance, walking through life as one walks through a graveyard at dusk, quiet, alone, bearing witness to the ruin and tragedy that seemed woven into the very fabric of his being. His path was not one of redemption or glory, but of enduring, surviving, despite the relentless bleakness that had haunted him from the moment he had drawn breath. In his solitude, he had become something more and less than human, a figure both tragic and terrible, marked by the scars of a life lived in the shadows. And perhaps he mused, in the deepest hours of night, this was his fate, to bear witness to a world he could never fully be a part of, to be both a participant and an observer, forever bound to a darkness as deep and inescapable as the void from which he had come. Insomuch, he walked, unbroken yet never whole, through a world that had turned its back on him long ago. There, in the silence of his own thoughts, he found the faintest echo of peace, a dark, melancholic beauty in the emptiness, a fragile stillness that resonated with the depths of his soul. His story began in Two Harbors, Minnesota, a quiet town nestled against the harsh beauty of Lake Superior, where the waves crashed with a ferocity that seemed to mirror his own inner turmoil. Here, amidst the towering pines and relentless winters, a young boy grew up feeling the sharp edge of isolation, his existence marked by an unspoken estrangement from the world around him. Two Harbors was the kind of place where silence carried weight, where the vastness of the landscape pressed down upon a person, leaving them to either find strength in solitude or crumble beneath it. In these early years, beneath skies that stretched on forever, his life seemed destined to be defined by the simple rhythms of small-town life, a world of fishing boats, logging trucks, and the creak of snow-laden branches in the bitter cold. But from the beginning, his was not a life that fit neatly within the confines of this place. Even as a child, he carried an aura that set him apart, a presence that unsettled those who crossed his path. The townsfolk watched him with wary eyes, sensing something beneath the surface that defied explanation, something dark and unyielding, like the frozen depths of the lake in winter. Two Harbors became both sanctuary and prison for him. The rugged landscape reflected his spirit, wild, untamed, and shadowed by an unspoken grief. Yet, as the years passed, the town also became the stage for his silent suffering, a place where his pain was as invisible as it was inescapable. In the dim halls of the local school, he endured the cruelty of classmates who saw his quietness as weakness, his difference as a threat. They taunted him, shoving him into lockers, whispering cruel words meant to wound. They even dragged him into the icy lake one winter, forcing him under, laughing as he gasped for breath amidst the freezing water. At home, things were scarcely better. His family, too, seemed to regard him with a distance that cut deeper than any physical blow. They mocked him for his solitude, for his inability to blend into the world they understood. They ridiculed his dreams and scorned his ambitions, dismissing his struggles as mere adolescent angst. As he grew older, they jeered at his lingering presence in their home, casting his desire for belonging as a weakness, a shame to be hidden. Through it all, Two Harbors stood as a silent witness to his suffering. The town bore his secrets, the pine forests and rocky shores absorbing his pain in the way only the wilderness can. Yet, even in this place that had given him nothing but heartache, he found a strange kinship with the raw beauty around him, the dark, churning waters of Lake Superior, the snow-covered trails winding into endless woods, the call of a distant loon at dusk. All these spoke to a part of him that the world seemed determined to deny. In the end, it was this place that shaped him, Two Harbors, embedding itself into his very soul. It became the crucible in which his spirit was forged. A place of immense beauty and unyielding hardship. And as he left, stepping out of the shadows of this cold, northern town, he carried with him the weight of every frozen night, every silent tear, every bitter word. He left Two Harbors as more than he had been before, but with a darkness etched into his heart, a darkness that would guide him, haunt him, and define him forever. The boy, named Maitreya Jacobs, entered the world at a time of historic collapse, on the very day the Berlin Wall fell, when the world began to witness the disintegration of the Soviet Union, monolithic structures of power, crumbling, disassembling under the weight of human conflict and failed ideologies. The symbolism was profound and unmissable. His birth aligned with the death of certainty, the dissolution of once unshakable forces. It was as though the universe itself had orchestrated this moment for his arrival, as though his life would mirror this cataclysm, this fall into chaos and uncertainty. Yet, unlike those who celebrated these events as moments of newfound freedom, the boy was shackled to the invisible walls that surrounded his existence. From his earliest days, the warm embrace of love never touched him. His mother, cold and indifferent, regarded him not as a child to nurture, but as a burden to bear. His father was an absent figure, lost to the tides of history, a casualty of the same forces that had reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The boy's early years were spent in a home devoid of affection, where silence reigned supreme, broken only by the echoes of his own unmet cries. The boy's heart ached for something he could never articulate, a yearning for warmth, for connection, for the validation that his existence mattered. He grew up in the unrelenting grip of winters that seemed to stretch endlessly, a realm where the cold was not merely a sensation, but an entire way of being. The snow blanketed everything, muffling sound, silencing life, and casting a stillness over the land that felt more like an abyss than a season. He knew nothing else, only the sweep of vast, silent fields of white and the howling winds that bent the trees like supplicants, the darkness settling in early each afternoon, as though day itself could no longer bear the weight of existence. In those early years, he grew accustomed to this stark, isolating beauty, a world where warmth was fleeting, where the rare bursts of sunlight only seemed to emphasize the immensity of the void. The cold seeped into his bones, whispering to him of solitude and survival. Wherever, he learned to live with the bitterness, wearing it as a second skin, a protective layer against the harshness of both nature and the people around him. The endless winter nights stretched on, merging with the quiet despair in his heart, leaving him alone with his thoughts, his pain, and the faint hope that perhaps, somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, there lay something more. But there, in the unforgiving cold, he found the resilience that others did not see, the quiet strength forged in frost, unyielding as the ice that glazed the lakes and rivers around him. This was his world, unadorned, raw, and merciless. The cold became both his prison and his liberation, a constant reminder of the vastness and indifference of life. He grew to embrace it, to find comfort in the solitude it offered, as though in that bitter, lightless landscape he had been granted a glimpse into a truth that was as eternal as the winter itself. As he grew older, his life descended deeper into darkness. Tragedy struck his body as it had struck his soul. Strokes, transient ischemic attacks, and traumatic brain injuries ravaged his young mind, leaving him scarred both physically and mentally. His brain became a battlefield where clarity, the one thing he desired above all else, was forever elusive. He longed for the stillness of a mind at peace, for the sharpness of thought that others took for granted. But instead, he was left with the unrelenting fog of confusion, the disorienting dizziness of a brain at war with itself. His world became a blur of half-formed thoughts, fleeting insights that vanished before he could grasp them, leaving him in a perpetual state of frustration and anguish. The boy, now a young man, was forced to watch as others around him squandered the gift he so desperately craved. They dulled their senses with drink and drugs, purposefully clouding their minds, as though clarity were a burden rather than a blessing. He looked on in quiet resentment, his broken body and mind aching for what they discarded so carelessly. He saw in them a waste, an affront to the very intelligence he had been denied. While they laughed and stumbled through life in a haze, he sat alone, trapped in his own mental prison, longing for the sharpness, the precision of thought that had been stolen from him by fate. As the years passed, the boy, no longer a boy, but a tormented young man, sank deeper into the abyss of mental anguish, diagnosed with major depressive disorder, MDD, and panic disorder. His mind was held hostage by an unceasing storm of anxiety and dread. His body was in a constant state of fight or flight, as though some unseen predator was always just beyond the horizon, threatening to tear him apart. For 18 long years, he lived in this state, every breath a battle against the suffocating weight of fear, every heartbeat a painful reminder that peace would never come. His panic attacks were not brief, fleeting moments of terror. They were an unrelenting assault on his sanity, a ceaseless torture that left him gasping for air, his mind in tatters, his soul worn thin. He was bullied relentlessly by peers who sensed his vulnerability, and by teachers who saw in him only a troublemaker, a boy too difficult to deal with. He was beaten, cheated, robbed, his childhood stolen from him, not by a single traumatic event, but by 1,000 tiny cruelties that piled up like stones on his chest, each one adding to the unbearable weight he carried. He was ostracized, blamed for things he hadn't done, used as a scapegoat by those who needed someone to bear the brunt of their own failures. Even the clergy, the supposed guardians of God's love, turned their backs on him, offering only judgment where he had hoped to find compassion. The police, too, saw him as nothing more than a problem to be dealt with, a stain on their neatly ordered world. His adolescence was a slow descent into darkness. There was no respite, no hope of escape from the cruelty of the world. The boy, now a young man, had long since stopped calling out to God, for God had never answered. Each prayer had gone unheard, each cry for help met with silence. He had reached for the heavens, but they had turned away from him, leaving him alone in his suffering. Wherever, in time, he turned elsewhere. If God would not listen, perhaps Satan would. The darkness that had been a part of his life since birth began to consume him fully. The visitor returned, no longer a vague presence, but a constant companion, whispering in his ear, showing him the truth of the world. There was no love, no kindness, no divine plan. There was only power, and the pain that came with it. The young man embraced this truth, for it was the only one that had ever made sense to him. In Satan, he found not salvation, but understanding. Satan did not offer him lies of hope and redemption. He offered him the cold, hard truth that life was suffering, that love was a lie, that the only way to survive was to embrace the darkness within. The young man's heart, once so full of longing for connection, now beat with a different rhythm. The yearning for love had been replaced by a hunger for power, for control over the chaos of his mind. He no longer sought clarity, for he knew it would never come. Instead, he sought domination over his own suffering. The world had wronged him, had beaten him down at every turn, but he would not be its victim any longer. He would rise, not as a figure of light, but as a creature of the abyss, born of darkness and molded by pain. And yet, even in his embrace of the void, there was tragedy, for no matter how much he tried to harden his heart, no matter how deeply he delved into the darkness, the flicker of his old self remained, a small, fragile flame that refused to die. It was the part of him that still yearned for love, that still ached for the connection he had been denied, and it was this part of him that made his descent into the abyss all the more tragic, for it meant that no matter how far he fell, no matter how much power he gained, he would never be free of the pain that had shaped his life. In the end, he was a creature of contradictions. He had turned his back on God, yet he still longed for the love that only God could give. He had embraced the darkness, yet a part of him still yearned for the light. He was powerful, yet powerless, strong, yet broken. His life was a study in tragedy, a testament to the cruelty of a world that had offered him nothing but suffering, and to the strength of a soul that had refused to break, even as it was shattered. He was a solitary figure against the stark horizon, drawn irresistibly to high places where he could look out over the vast and unfathomable sea. The cranes at the port became his sanctuary, towering metal giants where he could escape the world below. He'd climb their cold steel ladders until he reached the top, finding solace in the silence that only heights could offer. From there, he could see the endless stretch of water, dark and restless, mirroring his own depths. The sea, its immensity, its mystery, and the silent, relentless pull of the unknown, felt like a reflection of something inside him, something vast, untamed, and untouched by the warmth of the world. With a thermos of black coffee in hand and a soft pack of Lucky Strikes always within reach, he'd sit, letting the bitter heat seep into him as he inhaled the smoke. It was his ritual, a silent communion with the dark and the cold, with everything that seemed to exist beyond the realm of understanding. His head was usually shaved, though his raven dark hair would grow swiftly, a contrast to the thick beard that framed his face. Standing precisely 6 feet, he was strong and formidable, his presence as foreboding as the landscape he gazed upon. There was a rawness in him, a silent power that echoed the towering structures he climbed. The heights became a refuge, a place where he could exist undisturbed, suspended between sky and sea, as though the cold wind whipping around him was the only thing capable of grasping the storm within. People rarely understood him, and perhaps he preferred it that way. He lived in those high places. in the quiet, bleak beauty of his own solitude, and in the depths of the coffee and cigarettes that seemed as much a part of him as his dark thoughts and distant dreams. From his perch, he would stare down at the world below, detached yet deeply aware, carrying the weight of something unspeakable, something ancient and as unforgiving as the winter itself. When the world around him seemed too small, too stifling, he sought refuge in the merciless depths of the lake, venturing to the frigid shorelines even in the dead of winter. The icy winds would cut through him, and he would shiver, feeling the life drain from his limbs as he approached the black water. Without hesitation, he would step forward, each stride carrying him deeper, the chilling water swallowing him in a fierce, silent embrace. There, in that fathomless cold, he felt the weight of existence press upon him, felt the vast emptiness of it consume him. The water was dark, a shade of black that could absorb anything, hope, despair, the faintest flicker of warmth. And yet, it was here, in this eerie stillness, that he sought solace. He'd clasp his hands together, kneeling in the bitter waves, whispering silent prayers, pleas that melted into the endless void around him. He was praying not for rescue, but for understanding, for a revelation that could explain his place, his purpose, in this vast and indifferent world. He would beg, his words lost to the current, asking the waters for answers, for a sign, for anything to ground his existence. Each submersion was a ritual, a kind of baptism in reverse, as though by subjecting himself to the brutal cold, he could strip away the confusion, the doubt, the darkness that clouded his mind. There was a purity in the pain, a clarity in the numbness that came as his body surrendered to the frigid depths. But the answers never came, only the relentless cold, the indifferent waves that accepted him without judgment, but gave nothing in return. Time and again, he returned to these waters, drawn by a compulsion he could scarcely name, a hope that perhaps this time the lake would reveal its secrets. But each time he emerged as he'd entered, cold, shivering, alone, with only the silence of the deep as his answer. The lake seemed to understand him, to reflect the emptiness he felt, and yet it remained mute, a mirror of his own quiet despair. And as he trudged back to shore, he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of despair on his lips and the faint sting of a hope not yet forsaken, but always just out of reach. In his final moments, standing at the edge of the abyss, he realized the truth that had eluded him for so long. There was no escape, no salvation, no end to the suffering. The abyss did not offer release. It offered only more darkness. But in that darkness there was a strange kind of peace. He had spent his life fighting against the void, trying to find meaning in a world that offered none. Now, at last, he could stop fighting. He could let go and fall into the abyss that had been calling to him since the day he was born. In his final moments, standing at the edge of the abyss, he realized the truth that had eluded him for so long. There was no escape, no salvation, no end to the suffering. The abyss did not offer release. It offered only more darkness. But in that darkness there was a strange kind of peace. He had spent his life fighting against the void, trying to find meaning in a world that offered none. Now, at last, he could stop fighting. He could let go and fall into the abyss that had been calling to him since the day he was born. Therefore, with a final breath, he stepped forward into the endless, unrelenting dark. Autobiography of the Antichrist. All rights reserved. No part of this book, including the original poems, stories, and copyright-protected works of original art, may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including photocopying, recording, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except for brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law. For permission requests, please reach out to the author at terminusgenesis@gmail.com or find him on social media platforms under the business entity T3 Innovations or by name. Copyright page, ISBN 979-83449-24342, printed in the United States of America, 2nd edition,